Mediterranean Sea, off the Libyan coast, April 5, 1941. The cold seized him first, not the impact, not the chaos of metal tearing apart around him. The cold. Major General Adrien Carton de Wiart opened his one functioning eye to Mediterranean darkness. Water filled his lungs. Above him, somewhere beyond the black, moonlight fractured across the surface. His mind, trained by 3 wars and 61 years of calculated survival, performed its grim arithmetic. The Wellington bomber was gone, sinking fast. He was unconscious for how long? Seconds? Minutes? His left arm, or what remained of it, the stump that ended at the wrist, thrashed uselessly against the current. The right found purchase on something solid. Fabric, a body. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, young, unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Carton de Wiart made his choice without ceremony. He'd made 1,000 like it before. He kicked toward the shimmer above, dragging Morrison with him, the younger man's dead weight pulling them both down even as the general's legs scissored against the physics of drowning. When his head broke the surface, he sucked air with the desperate efficiency of a man who'd been shot in the face, the stomach, the groin, the ankle, the hip, and had learned that breath, like war, was something you took while you could. The shore glowed faintly, perhaps a mile distant. Italian-controlled Libya, enemy territory. "Wake up, you bloody fool," Carton de Wiart growled at Morrison, slapping the man's face with his one hand. "I didn't fish you out just to let you sleep." He began to swim. Tunis, Tunisia. April 1941. SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Rauff stepped off the transport plane into North African heat and calculated his empire. The airfield at Tunis shimmered under a sun that turned everything, tarmac, metal, men, into instruments of discomfort. But Rauff was accustomed to discomfort. He'd designed mobile gas chambers after all. Efficiency, he'd learned, often required tolerating temporary unpleasantness for permanent solutions. He was 44 years old, fastidiously dressed despite the journey, and carried a leather briefcase containing detailed census data on Tunisia's Jewish population. 70,000 names, 70,000 problems to be solved with the methodical precision that had earned him commendations in Berlin. Herr Obersturmbannführer. A junior officer snapped to attention. "Your quarters are prepared. The Governor-General requests your presence at 1800 hours. Rauff nodded, his pale eyes scanning the perimeter. Tunisia was chaos. Rommel's Africa Corps in retreat from Tobruk, British forces closing from the east, French colonial administrators playing their cowardly games of neutrality. But chaos, properly organized, became opportunity. He opened his briefcase, withdrew a leather journal, and made his first entry in precise Gothic script. Arrived Tunis. Weather favorable. Arab population appears cooperative. Jewish question requires immediate systematic attention. The pen hesitated only briefly before continuing. First priority, establish central registry. Second, identify concentration of assets. Third, implement labor draft for fortification construction per Kesselring directive. He did not write what he'd been told in Berlin, what Reinhard Heydrich himself had outlined, that once Rommel pushed through to Egypt and Palestine, Rauff's Einsatzkommando would follow, carrying out executive measures on the civilian population, the bureaucratic poetry for mass murder. But Rauff was a patient man. The Middle East's Jewish population could wait. First, Tunisia. First, the establishment of order. He closed the journal and looked east, toward Libya, where Field Marshal Rommel's panzers were already carving history into sand. Somewhere out there, the war was being won by men of action. Rauff preferred to win by administration. Libyan shore, April 5, 1941. Carton de Wiart's knees struck sand, and he released Morrison, who collapsed beside him, coughing seawater. The general remained on all fours for 30 seconds. He counted, as he always did, measuring recovery against the stopwatch of survival, before rising to his feet. His uniform clung to him like a second skin of cold cotton. The eye patch, miraculously, remained in place. His missing hand, well, that hadn't changed. "Can you walk?" he asked Morrison. The young officer nodded, still retching. "Good, because those are Italian patrol lights and they're coming this way." Indeed, 3 beams swept across the beach from the north, accompanied by the growl of motorcycle engines. Carton de Wiart considered his options with the speed of a man who'd spent 40 years in combat. They were waterlogged, weaponless, exhausted, and surrounded by hostile territory. He raised his one hand above his head. "Well," he said to Morrison, "at least we're not dead. That's rather better than I expected, given the circumstances." The motorcycles arrived in a spray of sand. Italian soldiers, very young, leveled rifles with shaking hands. An officer, older, stepped forward and stopped cold when he saw the figure standing before him. Soaking wet, one-eyed, one-handed, ramrod straight, with a salt and pepper mustache and an expression of profound annoyance. "General," the Italian stammered. "Major General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart," he replied in flawless parade ground English, as if introducing himself at a garden party rather than surrendering on an enemy beach. "British Army, and you've just captured rather a prize, I'm afraid. I do hope your superiors are prepared for the paperwork." The Italian officer, to his credit, recovered quickly. He gestured with his pistol toward the waiting vehicles. As they led him away, Carton de Wiart glanced back once at the Mediterranean. The Wellington was gone, swallowed by water. Churchill's urgent mission to Yugoslavia, gone. His freedom, gone. But he was alive. And in 40 years of war, he'd learned something that terrified his enemies more than any weapon. Adrian Carton de Wiart had never accepted defeat as permanent. Behind him, the sea whispered against sand. Ahead, in a Tuscan castle he didn't yet know existed, a prison cell waited. And beyond that, in Tunisia, an SS officer named Walter Rauff was opening his journal to record his first day in North Africa, beginning a campaign of systematic horror that would make the desert run with blood and gold. 2 men, 2 wars. One would become a nightmare to his captors. The other would become a nightmare to the world. The Mediterranean sun climbed higher, indifferent to both. Shimber Barras, British Somaliland, November 1914. The mountain rose like a broken tooth from the African plateau, and at its summit, a stone blockhouse squatted in defiance of the morning sun. Inside, followers of the man the British called the Mad Mullah, Mohammed bin Abdullah Hassan, waited with rifles that had killed better men than the ones approaching. Captain Adrian Carton de Wiart, 34 years old, leading the Somaliland Camel Corps up the rocky slope, felt the Kharif wind heavy with sand against his face. It was pleasant, actually, compared to the furnace heat of the lowlands. He'd lied to get here, lied about his age at 20 to fight the Boers, lied about his fitness after being shot in the stomach and groin, lied about wanting to stay at Oxford when all he wanted was this, the clarifying simplicity of men moving toward danger because someone had to. "Sir," Lieutenant Hastings Ismay appeared at his elbow, breathless from the climb. "The Indian Battalion reports. The bullet hit Carton de Wiart in the arm. The sound came after, a flat crack that echoed off stone. He stumbled, caught himself with his other hand, examined the wound with the detached interest of a butcher inspecting meat. Bloody nuisance," he muttered. "Continue your report." Ismay stared at him. Blood darkened the captain's sleeve, spreading like spilled wine. "The Indian Battalion, sir, there. The second bullet took him in the face. The world became light and pain and the taste of copper." Carton de Wiart felt himself falling, not backward, which would have been dignified, but sideways, in an ungainly sprawl that annoyed him, even as his vision collapsed into red darkness. When consciousness returned, seconds, minutes, he was on his back, staring at African sky. His left eye saw blue, his right eye saw nothing at all, just a wet, screaming absence where his eye had been. Ismay's face appeared above him, white with shock. "Captain, don't move, sir, the doctor—" "What happened to the blockhouse?" Carton de Wiart's voice came out as a rasp. "Sir, you've been shot in the face, your eye—" "I asked about the bloody blockhouse, Lieutenant. The ricochet had angled upward," Ismay would later explain. The bullet had entered below Carton de Wiart's left eye, destroyed it completely, and exited through his temple. Part of his ear was gone too. He should have been dead, or at least unconscious. Instead, he was trying to sit up. "Stay down, sir, please." Ismay pressed his shoulder. "The doctor says there's nothing to be done for the eye. We need to evacuate you." Carton de Wiart processed this information with the methodical calm of a man calculating acceptable losses. One eye. Still had the other. 2 arms, 2 legs. Brain apparently functional, given he could count his remaining assets. "Tell the men to continue the assault," he said. They carried him down Shimber Barras on a stretcher, while the Indian Battalion tried, and failed, to take the blockhouse. By morning, the dervishes had escaped under cover of darkness. On the transport ship to London, holding a compress to the socket where his eye had been, Carton de Wiart made a decision. He would view this not as a loss, but as liberation. One eye meant he could no longer be held to rear duties. One eye meant he looked dangerous enough that men would follow him without question. One eye meant he could return to Europe, where the real war, the Great War, was turning France into an abattoir. Lord Ismay, decades later, would write, "I honestly believe that he regarded the loss of an eye as a blessing, as it allowed him to get out of Somaliland to Europe, where he thought the real action was. Carton de Wyatt never corrected him. London Military Hospital, December 1914. They fitted him with a glass eye. Regulation. The War Office couldn't very well send visibly wounded officers back to combat. It was terrible for morale, made the public anxious, suggested that war was something other than glorious. Carton de Wyatt wore the glass eye for exactly 2 hours before he threw it out of a taxi window on his way back to Dover. The eye patch he acquired instead, black silk, simple, practical, became his signature. With it, he looked less like a wounded soldier and more like something from a different century. A privateer, a buccaneer who'd misplaced his ship. "You look like a bloody pirate," his commanding officer told him when he reported for duty. "Good," Carton de Wyatt replied. "Pirates are hard to kill." Western Front, Ypres, May 1915. The German artillery shell landed 12 feet away, close enough that Carton de Wyatt felt the compression wave before the shrapnel arrived. Time became elastic. He watched his left hand, his good hand, the one he'd used to pull men from trenches and write letters home, disintegrate in a spray of blood and bone. 2 fingers hung by threads of skin, the wrist bent at an angle that violated anatomy. Around him men screamed. Earth rained down. The crater steamed with chemical residue. A doctor reached him within minutes. Miraculous, given the chaos. Young, competent. He examined the hand with practiced efficiency. "We'll save it," the doctor announced. "Surgery can repair, amputate," Carton de Wyatt said. "Sir, I really think the fingers are gone, the hand is useless. Cut it off so I can return to duty. I can't just—" Carton de Wyatt gripped the dangling fingers with his right hand and pulled. They came away with a wet tearing sound that made the doctor vomit. "There," he said, dropping the fingers into the mud. "Now you only have to deal with the hand. I'll wait." In his autobiography, written decades later with characteristic understatement, Carton de Wyatt would record, "I asked the doctor to take my fingers off. He refused, so I pulled them off myself, and felt absolutely no pain in doing it." The hand came off properly in surgery. They fitted him with a prosthetic, clumsy, uncomfortable. He discarded it. Better to have an empty sleeve and one strong hand than to pretend wholeness. The Somme, July 1916. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Carton de Wyatt led the 8th Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment into the meat grinder of the Somme, he'd been wounded 8 times. Shot in the skull, the ankle, the hip, the leg, the ear again. Each time he'd returned to duty with the inevitability of a bad penny. His men called him the Unkillable, not to his face but with the superstitious reverence soldiers reserve for omens. They watched him pull grenade pins with his teeth and hurl them one-handed into German trenches, watched him walk upright through machine gun fire while they cowered in shell holes, watched him take command when superior officers fell, his parade ground voice cutting through chaos like a blade. At La Boiselle, with German positions dug into the chalky hillside and British bodies piling like cordwood, Carton de Wyatt led a charge that should have been suicide. Sergeant William Wilson, who survived the war and gave testimony at the Victoria Cross hearing, described it. The colonel advanced across open ground with total disregard for the enemy fire. He rallied the men when they wavered, personally led 4 separate attacks, and continued fighting even after being wounded again. His courage was beyond anything I have witnessed. The Victoria Cross citation would use more formal language for most conspicuous bravery, coolness, and determination during severe operations of a prolonged nature. But his men knew the truth. Adrian Carton de Wyatt stayed on his feet because falling would mean admitting that bullets could stop him. And if bullets could stop him, they could stop anyone. That was unacceptable. London, Armistice Day, November 11, 1918. Brigadier General Carton de Wyatt stood in his flat, alone, listening to church bells announce the end of the Great War. Around him, London erupted in celebration. In the streets below, people danced. He poured himself a whiskey with his remaining hand and regarded his reflection in the darkened window. One eye, one hand, 38 years old, a body that clicked and ached with embedded shrapnel, pieces of German artillery that would work their way to the surface for the rest of his life. In his journal, he wrote a single line that would scandalize readers when published decades later. "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war. Not the dying, not the suffering, but the purpose, the clarity, the knowledge that every morning he woke up was a morning he'd earned through sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit." Outside, the bells rang. Inside, Adrian Carton de Wyatt finished his whiskey and began planning his return to Poland, where small wars still simmered and men like him remained useful. The pirate, it seemed, was not ready to retire his colors. Not yet, not ever, if he had anything to say about it. Berlin, Reich Security Main Office, January 1938. Walter Rauff's naval career ended not with honor, but with a woman and a scandal. He sat across from Reinhard Heydrich in an office that smelled of leather and cigarette smoke, his Kriegsmarine uniform replaced by civilian clothes that fit poorly. 31 years old, disgraced, dishonorably discharged for conducting an affair with a married woman, and then, in a spectacular failure of judgment, attempting to smear his own wife as an adulteress to win his divorce case. The Navy had shown him the door, but Heydrich, pale and predatory behind his desk, saw something useful in failure. "You commanded minesweepers," Heydrich said, not asking. The SD chief already knew everything. "You understand logistics, chain of command, the management of difficult operations." "Yes, Obergruppenführer. The Sicherheitsdienst requires men with organizational skills. Men who understand that Germany's enemies are not merely military, but ideological, racial." Heydrich's fingers drummed once on the desk. "Men who can implement policy without sentimentality." Rauff met his gaze. In Heydrich's eyes, one slightly higher than the other, a genetic defect that made him look perpetually calculating, Rauff recognized something familiar, the understanding that efficiency mattered more than conscience. That history remembered victors, not methods. "I can do that," Rauff said. "Good. Report to Prince Albrechtstrasse Monday morning. You'll begin in technical services." Technical services. It sounded innocuous. Clean. It was anything but. Prince Albrechtstrasse 8, Berlin, June 1941. The problem, as Rauff explained to the engineering contractor, was efficiency. "The Einsatzgruppen in the East are liquidating thousands daily," he said, spreading blueprints across the table in the Criminal Technical Institute. "But bullets are expensive. Soldiers develop psychological difficulties. We need a more streamlined solution." "Do you?" The contractor, a civilian named Friedrich Pradl, who owned a chassis modification company, studied the drawings with the detached interest of a man pricing kitchen renovations. "A sealed compartment," Pradl mused. "Exhaust diverted from the engine into the cargo area. How many subjects per vehicle? 30 to 50. Journey time approximately 15 to 20 minutes from collection point to disposal site. The exhaust will need to be concentrated. Perhaps a smaller engine space, better compression." They spoke in euphemisms, not people, but subjects. Not murder, but special treatment. Not screaming children clawing at locked doors, but processing efficiency. Rauff took notes in his meticulous handwriting, time studies, cost analyses, fuel consumption rates per operation. The first gas van, rolled out 3 weeks later. A large truck, externally unremarkable. Inside, a sealed compartment, a hose running from the exhaust pipe, a driver's cabin separated by soundproof metal. The trial run occurred outside Minsk. Rauff did not attend personally, that would have been inefficient, but he read the after-action report with the satisfaction of an engineer whose prototype exceeded specifications. 47 subjects processed in 18 minutes. No ammunition expended. Psychological impact on personnel, minimal. Recommendation, increase fleet production. By December 1941, 20 Gaswagen operated across occupied territory. By the time the war ended, they would kill an estimated 200,000 people. Rauff's personnel file contained a commendation. SS Obersturmbannführer Rauff has demonstrated exceptional technical competence and organizational ability in support of Reich security operations. What it meant, he'd industrialized murder. What it didn't say, he felt nothing about it at all. Rauff's Berlin apartment, November 1941. At home, Walter Rauff was a different man. Or perhaps the same man, viewed from a different angle. He ate dinner with his wife Edith and stepson in a modest flat near Charlottenburg. They discussed ordinary things, rationing, the weather, the boys' schoolwork. Edith never asked about his work. A good German wife knew better. After dinner, Rauff sat at his desk and wrote in his personal journal. Not the official reports filed with the RSHA, but private observations. His handwriting remained precise. Each letter formed with geometric care. November 18, 1941. The technical challenges of the current project continue to require creative solutions. Pradl suggests modifications to ventilation systems. I remain unconvinced. Simplicity in design reduces maintenance requirements. Must review Kiev operation reports for confirmation. No mention of what operation meant. No names of the dead. Just problems and solutions. Inputs and outputs. The bureaucratic reduction of genocide to flowcharts. He closed the journal, kissed his wife goodnight, and slept soundly. This, perhaps, was Walter Rauff's greatest crime. Not the murders he enabled, but the absolute absence of doubt. He possessed the sociopath's gift, the ability to separate consequence from action, to see suffering as data. A British interrogator would later describe him as, by nature cynical and overbearing, but cunning and shifty rather than intelligent. It was unfair. Ralph was intelligent, terrifyingly so. He simply directed that intelligence toward problems that required the murder of humans to solve. Tunisia, November 1942. When Ralph's plane touched down in North Africa, he brought his journals, his organizational charts, and a census of Tunisia's Jewish population compiled by Vichy French collaborators. 70,000 names, addresses, assets. The war had turned. Rommel's Africa Corps, once unstoppable, now retreated westward after the disaster at El Alamein. British forces pressed from Egypt. American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. Tunisia became the last Axis stronghold in Africa, a bridgehead between catastrophe and survival. And Ralph saw opportunity. His first meeting with the local Vichy Governor-General established the framework. Seated in a requisitioned villa overlooking the Mediterranean, Ralph laid out his plan with the casual precision of a tax collector. The Jewish population represents both a security threat and an economic resource, he explained. I propose immediate registration, confiscation of portable assets, and labor conscription for fortification construction. The governor, a Frenchman named Esteva, who'd spent 3 decades perfecting the art of collaboration, nodded weakly. The population is already nervous. Perhaps we should proceed carefully. Carefully waste time we don't have. Ralph opened his briefcase, withdrew a typed directive. Field Marshal Kesselring has authorized full implementation. Your signature here transfers administrative authority to the SD, Esteva signed. Men like him always did. Within a week, Ralph's Einsatzkommando began operations. Djerba Island, Tunisia, December 1942. The ancient synagogue on Djerba had stood for centuries, a repository of Torah scrolls and silver ritual objects that had survived countless invaders. It took Ralph's men 3 hours to strip it clean. 43 kilograms of gold, silver candlesticks, ancient manuscripts wrapped in silk. The local rabbi, an elderly man named Haddad, watched in silence as SS soldiers carried out crates. When they demanded he open the synagogue's vault, he refused. An SS sergeant broke 3 of his fingers with a rifle butt. He opened the vault. Ralph, reviewing the inventory report in his Tunis office, made a notation. Djerba operation, successful. Local religious leadership proved cooperative after minimal persuasion. Recommend similar approach for mainland communities. In the streets of Tunis, Jewish men wore yellow stars. Ralph had instituted the requirement within days of arrival. Good Germans appreciated visual identification of problems. Labor camps appeared in the countryside, officially for fortification construction. In reality, slave labor camps where men died of exhaustion, disease, and casual violence. Over 2,500 Tunisian Jews would perish in these camps before the Axis collapse. In his journal, Ralph wrote with the detachment of a factory manager reviewing production quotas. Labor draft proceeding adequately. Mortality rates acceptable given operational time frame. Arab population cooperation exceeds expectations. Recommend financial incentives for informants. He never used words like murder or theft. Such terms implied moral judgment. Ralph dealt in policy implementation, not morality. Tunis, April 1943. By spring, the situation had become untenable. American and British forces tightened the noose around Tunisia. Rommel, recalled to Germany, was replaced by commanders who understood they were fighting a delaying action, not a campaign. Ralph stood at his office window watching Allied bombers pass overhead like migrating birds. In his briefcase lay contingency plans for evacuation to Italy. But first, one final operation. He'd proposed to Berlin that Tunisia's remaining Jewish population, approximately 70,000 people, be used as human shields along the defensive lines. Position them between Allied forces and Axis positions. Force the Americans to choose between advancing and massacring civilians. The proposal went nowhere, not because Berlin found it monstrous, but because logistics made it impractical. Moving 70,000 people required transport the Axis no longer possessed. Ralph closed his journal with something approaching disappointment. The Jewish question in North Africa would remain unsolved, but Italy awaited. Milan needed an experienced SD commander, and Walter Rauff, bureaucrat of death, had become very experienced indeed. He packed his journals carefully, ensured his personnel file reflected his superb achievements in Tunisia, and boarded the last transport to Sicily. Behind him, Tunisia burned. Ahead, more efficient murders awaited. The machine required feeding. Ralph had learned to keep it running. Villa Orsini, Sulmona, Italy, May 1941. The Italian colonel who processed Carton de Wiar's intake paperwork kept staring at the empty sleeve. "General," he said carefully in heavily accented English, "you are comfortable? We can provide medical attention if—" "I'm perfectly comfortable, thank you." Carton de Wiar sat ramrod straight in the wooden chair, his one good hand resting on his knee. Behind him, 2 guards stood at awkward attention, unsure how to handle a prisoner who acted like he was inspecting them, rather than the reverse. The colonel consulted his notes. "It says here you are 61 years old, correct? And you swam 1 mile to shore after your aircraft crashed. Approximately 1 mile, I didn't measure, while carrying an injured man. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, is he well?" The colonel blinked. "He is recovering, yes. General, forgive me, but your hand, your eye, these are old injuries." "Ancient history. The eye was 1914, the hand 1915. Haven't missed either much, to be honest." The colonel made a notation, shaking his head slightly. In his 20 years of military service, he'd never encountered anything like the one-eyed, one-handed British general, who'd emerged from the Mediterranean like some sort of waterlogged pirate and immediately demanded to know about his men. "You will be transferred to a special facility," the colonel said finally. For senior officers." "How special?" "Very secure, very comfortable. You understand, General, that you are quite a valuable prisoner?" Carton de Wiart smiled, the expression predatory beneath his salt and pepper mustache. "Then you'd better make sure I stay that way." Castello di Vinciliata, Tuscany, August 1941. The medieval castle rose from Tuscan hills like something from a Gothic novel. Stone towers, narrow windows, walls built to withstand siege weapons that hadn't existed for 5 centuries. It had been converted into a prison for high-ranking British officers captured in North Africa during Rommel's devastating counter-offensive. Carton de Wiart's arrival caused a stir. Lieutenant General Sir Richard O'Connor, captured in April along with his successor Lieutenant General Philip Neame, V.C., watched from an upper window as guards escorted the new prisoner across the courtyard. "Good God," O'Connor muttered. "Is that Carton de Wiart?" Neame confirmed. "I'd recognize that eye patch anywhere." Below, Carton de Wiart surveyed his new home with the critical eye of a man evaluating real estate. 60-foot walls, guards on the ramparts, a single entrance. The castle had been built to keep people out. It would work just as well for keeping them in. "Gentlemen," he called up to the window, "I don't suppose there's tea." The castle, October 1941. Within a week, Carton de Wiart had established himself as the prison's most difficult resident. He made his first escape attempt on a Tuesday. The plan was simple. Scale the courtyard wall during evening exercise, drop 40 feet to the ground below, sprint across open hillside before the guards could respond, and disappear into the Tuscan countryside. Simple, suicidal, exactly Carton de Wiart's style. He made it as far as the top of the wall, no small feat for a 61-year-old man with one hand, before a guard spotted him. The Italian soldiers, trained for many contingencies, had not been trained for dealing with a British general hanging one-handed from medieval stonework while cursing in 3 languages. They hauled him back down. The camp commandant, a weary major named Ricciardi, who would come to know Carton de Wiart very well, read him the regulations on escape attempts. "Generale, you will be confined to your quarters for 7 days." "Fair enough," Carton de Wiart replied cheerfully. "Worth a try. You could have broken your neck, but I didn't." Ricciardi studied the British officer with mingled exasperation and unwilling respect. "Why, General, you are treated well here. You receive Red Cross parcels. We are not barbarians." "Because it's Tuesday," Carton de Wiart said. "And I'm a soldier, not a house guest." The castle, January 1942. The prisoners developed a routine. Morning roll call, afternoon exercise in the courtyard, evenings playing bridge or reading months-old newspapers. The Italian guards were professional but not cruel. The food was adequate. For most prisoners, it was bearable. For Carton de Wiart, it was intolerable. "We need to get out," he announced during one evening gathering in O'Connor's quarters. O'Connor, who'd captured 130,000 Italian prisoners during his North African campaign before Rommel's arrival, understood the obligation. Officers were expected to escape. It was duty, not recreation. "The walls are too high," he said. "Even for you, Adrian." "Then we go under them." Brigadier John Combe, another Rommel trophy, laughed. "Through 60 feet of medieval foundation? With what tools?" Carton de Wiart smiled. "With these." He produced a collection of items scavenged over months. a sturdy spoon from the mess hall, a chisel stolen from the maintenance shed, several pieces of sharpened metal. You're serious, Neem said. Always. That's solid rock. It would take months, years even. Then we'd better start now. The tunnel. March 1942, October 1942. They began in a storage room beneath the castle's east tower. Working in shifts, muffling sound with blankets, they attacked the foundation with the methodical patience of men who had nothing but time. Carton de Huillard, despite having only one hand, took the longest shifts. Hour after hour, he chiseled at rock by candlelight, his remaining arm developing rope-like muscles as he worked. O'Connor organized the operation with military precision. Work schedules, watch rotations, disposal of excavated material in the castle's ancient well. The other prisoners provided cover, elaborate bridge games during work hours, deliberately loud conversations to mask the sounds of digging. The guards suspected nothing. Why would they? The prisoners seemed content. No one had tried to escape in months. The Italian commandant Ricciardi even commented to his superiors, "The British generals have settled in well. Morale appears good." What he didn't see, the nightly progress reports O'Connor recorded in code in his personal journal. The slowly expanding tunnel, the whispered calculations about distance, direction, and the guards' patrol patterns. By October 1942, they dug 60 feet through solid rock, 60 feet that led, if their measurements were correct, beyond the castle walls, 60 feet carved largely by a 62-year-old man with one hand. The escape, March 29, 1943. They went on a moonless night. 6 men, Carton de Huillard, O'Connor, Neem, Combe, and 2 others. The tunnel opened, as planned, in a grove of olive trees 300 yards from the castle perimeter. They emerged like ghosts, covered in rock dust, blinking in the darkness. "Well," Carton de Huillard whispered, "that wasn't so difficult." They split into pairs. Carton de Huillard and O'Connor headed northwest toward Switzerland. 250 miles through Axis-controlled Italy. They carried 25-pound packs, maps drawn from memory, identity papers forged by Major General Michael Gambier Perry, who developed an unexpected talent for document creation. And one tremendous disadvantage: neither spoke Italian fluently. They walked 32 miles the first night, Tuscan countryside, April 6, 1943. For 8 days, they were free. O'Connor, who spoke passable Italian, did the talking. They slept in hay barns, avoided main roads, and moved only at night. Twice they encountered German patrols and bluffed their way through with forged papers and O'Connor's confident manner. Carton de Huillard, with his eye patch and empty sleeve, played the part of an injured factory worker being escorted home. On the 8th day, in a small village near the Swiss border, they encountered 2 carabinieri who actually checked their papers carefully. The forgeries didn't pass inspection. Back to Vinciliata, April 1943. Ricciardi met them at the castle gate. He looked older, more tired. "General Carton de Huillard," he said heavily. 150 miles, 8 days. You are 62 years old with one arm. 153 miles, Carton de Huillard corrected. "We took a detour around Florence. This is not amusing. Wasn't meant to be." Ricciardi gestured to the guards. 30 days solitary confinement, both of you. As they were led away, O'Connor murmured, "Worth it?" "Absolutely," Carton de Huillard replied. Behind them, Ricciardi stood in the courtyard, watching. He would later write in his report, "The British generals, particularly Carton de Huillard, represent a unique security challenge. Their determination to escape borders on the pathological. Recommend transfer to higher security facility." But there was no higher security facility, just a castle, and a one-eyed general who refused to accept that walls, even 60-foot medieval walls, could hold him. The guards' barracks, April 1943. That night, in the guards' quarters, the story spread. The one-eyed British general, 62 years old. One hand, 7 months digging through rock, 150 miles on foot through enemy territory. 8 days free despite looking like a pirate from a children's book. The younger guards laughed. Impossible. Exaggerated. The older ones who'd watched Carton de Huillard work on the tunnel didn't laugh. They'd seen the scars, counted the wounds, watched him exercise each morning with the discipline of a man half his age. "He's not human," one whispered. "He's British," another replied. Same thing, apparently. The story traveled, from guards to their families, from families to neighboring villages, from villages to German liaison officers who visited the castle, and from there to Tunisia, where SS officers planning the final defense heard about the indestructible British general who simply would not stay captured. Walter Rauff, preparing his evacuation from Tunis, made a note in his journal. Reports from Italian command regarding British POW escape attempts. Carton de Wiart, age 62, severely disabled. Led successful tunnel operation. Psychological warfare value, significant. Recommendation: dissemination of such stories damages Axis morale. He was right, but Ralph misunderstood something fundamental. It wasn't propaganda, it was just Adrian Carton de Wiart doing what he'd always done, refusing to quit. The castle walls stood firm, the general did not. Tunis, SS headquarters, December 1942. The intelligence report landed on Walter Ralph's desk with the routine banality of all military paperwork. 5 pages, typewritten, filed under Allied command structure, prisoners of war. Ralph read it during his morning coffee, between reviewing labor camp mortality statistics and planning the next Jewish property confiscation. British Lieutenant General Adrian Carton de Wiart, the report began. Age 62. Current location, Castello di Vincigliata, Italy. Combat record, Boer War, WWI, WWKBUs. Decorations, Victoria Cross, DSO. Notable, lost left eye 1914. Lost left hand 1915. Multiple escape attempts from current facility including 7-month tunnel excavation. Ralph paused, reread the passage. 7 months, one hand, 62 years old. He made a notation in his journal. Italian security protocols clearly inadequate. Such prisoners should be transferred to German custody for proper containment. But something about the report unsettled him. Not fear. Ralph didn't experience fear in any conventional sense, more like recognition. The understanding that some men simply operated outside normal parameters. In the SS, they bred such men deliberately, selected for ruthlessness, trained for absolute obedience, created soldiers who could implement the unthinkable without hesitation. But this British general, mutilated, elderly, trapped in a medieval castle, had made himself extraordinary through sheer refusal to accept limitation. It was, Ralph thought, disturbingly inefficient. The man should have retired decades ago. Instead, he dug through stone, forced labor camp outside Tunis, January 1943. While Carton de Wiart tunneled through castle foundations, Tunisian Jews died in Ralph's camps. The official designation was Fortification Construction Labor Battalion. The reality was slower murder, 12-hour work days, starvation rations, beatings for insufficient productivity, disease spreading through overcrowded barracks, no medical care, guards who viewed their charges as less than human because their superiors had told them so repeatedly. In 3 months, over 500 men died. Ralph inspected the camps monthly, reviewing efficiency reports with the same clinical detachment he'd brought to the Gaswagen project. Mortality rates, labor output, cost per prisoner per day. The Jewish workers are proving less durable than anticipated, his site commander reported during one inspection. Productivity has declined 18%. Increase rations marginally, Ralph decided. Dead workers produce nothing. We need functional labor until evacuation. It was the closest he came to mercy, a pragmatic calculation that starving men worked poorly. The ration increase saved perhaps 50 lives. Ralph noted it as a successful optimization. SS Officers' Mess, Tunis, February 1943. The stories about the British prisoners in Italy had spread through the German officer corps like a virus. Over dinner, a Wehrmacht liaison officer mentioned it. Did you hear about that British general? One eye, one hand keeps escaping from Vincigliata. Ralph, cutting his schnitzel with geometric precision, looked up. Carton de Wiart, you know him? I know of him. The Italians can't seem to hold him. An SS Hauptsturmführer laughed. One old cripple giving them trouble? Typical Italian incompetence. But an older officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, didn't laugh. I served in Russia. We had commissars like that, men who wouldn't die no matter what you did to them. They're worse than fresh troops. They make the others believe they can't lose. Ralph understood. Propaganda value, morale effects. The British would use Carton de Wiart's story to inspire their soldiers. Look what one elderly disabled general can accomplish. Imagine what you can do. He should be shot, the Hauptsturmführer said casually. Attempting escape is grounds for execution. The Italians won't do it. He's too valuable as a hostage. Then he'll keep trying. Men like that don't stop. Ralph thought about this. Men who don't stop. Men who tunnel through stone with one hand. Men who swim a mile at age 61. Men who view injury as inconvenience rather than limitation. They represented something the SS could never quite manufacture, despite all their ideology and training. Genuine, irrational, suicidal determination. The SS created obedience, but will, That came from somewhere else. Let the Italians worry about him, Ralph said finally. We have more pressing concerns. Outside, Allied bombers passed overhead, and the ground trembled. Ralph's private quarters, March 1943. Late at night, alone, Ralph wrote in his journal by lamplight. March 15, 1943. Situation deteriorating. American forces advancing faster than anticipated. Evacuation planning proceeding. Jewish labor question remains unresolved. Berlin has rejected proposal for strategic repositioning of remaining population. Will likely be forced to abandon operations incomplete. He paused, pen hovering. Reports continue regarding British POW escapes. The one called Carton de Wiart has become something of a legend among Italian guards. They speak of him with superstitious dread, as if he were supernatural rather than simply obstinate. This psychological effect is precisely what makes such men dangerous. Not their physical capability, but their symbolic value. They become myths, and myths are harder to kill than men. Another pause, then. We have created our own myths, of course. The invincible Reich, the master race, the final solution. But myths require belief, and belief requires victories. We are running short of victories. It was the closest Ralph ever came to doubt, not about the rightness of his actions, but about their ultimate success. He closed the journal. Outside, the Mediterranean wind carried the smell of smoke from the labor camps. The last message. April 1943. The decoded intelligence intercept arrived from Berlin with urgent classification. British agent in Italy reported, Carton de Wiart escaped Vinciliata, March 29th. Recaptured April 6th after a 150-mile journey on foot. Italian command reports prisoner morale dangerously high despite capture. Recommend. The recommendation was redacted, but Ralph could guess. Eliminate the problem permanently. The Italians wouldn't do it. Too civilized, too concerned with international law. The SS would have done it immediately. A bullet, a convenient accident, problem solved. But Carton de Wiart wasn't Ralph's problem. He was in Italy, digging tunnels and embarrassing his captors, while Ralph packed his files for evacuation to Milan. Still, the British general represented something that gnawed at the edges of Ralph's certainty. The SS built systems, implemented solutions, optimized processes. They reduced everything to bureaucracy and bullets. But one elderly, mutilated man with one hand had spent 7 months digging through rock and walked 150 miles through enemy territory for no reason, except that surrender was unacceptable to him. No orders commanded it. No ideology demanded it. No system engineered it. Just one man refusing. And somehow that refusal had reached Tunisia. Had reached the guards at the labor camps, had reached the Jewish prisoners who whispered about the indestructible British general. Myths, Ralph had written, are harder to kill than men. He was right, but he'd misunderstood which myth would survive. His, the 1,000-year Reich, the final solution, the master race, would end in bunkers and trials and shallow graves. Carton de Wiart, the pirate who wouldn't quit, would be taught to grandchildren. In May 1943, Tunisia fell. Ralph fled to Italy, his files intact, his hands clean of blood in any legal sense. Behind him, the labor camps opened. The survivors staggered out, skeletal and traumatized. Among them, stories circulated about the SS monster who'd stolen their gold and worked them to death, and about the British general with one eye who kept escaping, kept fighting, kept refusing. The prisoners knew which story gave them hope. The nightmare, it turned out, wasn't the pirate. It was the bureaucrat, and nightmares eventually end. The last Axis soldiers in North Africa surrendered on a Thursday. 275,000 men laid down their weapons. The Africa Corps, once invincible, marched into captivity. Tunisia, blood-soaked and exhausted, fell silent except for the wind off the Mediterranean. Walther Rauff was not among the prisoners. He'd flown to Milan 3 weeks earlier, his journals and personnel files packed carefully, his service record documenting exceptional organizational ability in Tunisia. The 43 kilograms of gold stolen from Djerba's synagogue had been shipped separately. Efficiency, always. In Milan, he would establish new operations, hunt Italian partisans, perfect his craft. The Hotel Regina would become his headquarters, its rooms converted to torture chambers. He would survive the war, escape to South America, die free in Chile in 1984, age 77. surrounded by old Nazis who attended his funeral. Justice would never find him. Castello di Vincigliata, August 1943. Adrien Carton de Wiart was reading a 3-month-old Times when the guards came for him. General, Ricciardi said quietly, you are to be released. Carton de Wiart looked up from his paper. I beg your pardon? The Italian government. There are negotiations. You are being sent to Lisbon to carry messages to the British. Italy was secretly abandoning the war. They needed an intermediary the British would trust, a high-ranking prisoner whose release would demonstrate good faith. They chose the one-eyed general who'd spent 2 years trying to escape. The irony was not lost on Carton de Wiart. Well, he said, folding the newspaper carefully, about bloody time. Lisbon, Portugal, August 28, 1943. He stepped off the plane into neutral sunshine, free for the first time in 28 months. Churchill summoned him to Chequers within days. They met in the Prime Minister's study, 2 old warriors who'd spent lifetimes at war. Churchill poured whiskey with trembling hands. He was 68, exhausted, carrying the weight of a global conflict. Carton de Wiart, at 63, looked younger. Prison had slimmed him. The eye patch made him look dangerous. The empty sleeve made him look indestructible. China, Churchill said without preamble. I need you to be my personal representative to Chiang Kai-shek. The Americans and British are squabbling. The Chinese are suspicious. I need someone who can't be bullied. When do I leave? You're not going to ask for rest? Medical leave? You've been in a bloody castle for 2 years. Carton de Wiart smiled. And I'm thoroughly rested. When do I leave? 3 weeks later, he was in Chongqing, negotiating with Chinese generals and American commanders, who couldn't believe this one-eyed, one-handed elderly man was Churchill's personal representative. He would serve there until 1946, 3 more years of war, because Adrien Carton de Wiart didn't know how to retire. 2 legacies. The war ended. Nuremberg trials began. Evidence mounted. Documents, testimony, the careful records kept by men like Ralph who'd bureaucratized murder. But Ralph himself vanished into South American anonymity. The monster escaped. Carton de Wiart retired to Ireland, married again at 70, and spent his final years fishing and writing his memoirs with characteristic understatement. He titled them Happy Odyssey. He died peacefully in 1963, age 83, having survived 3 wars, 11 major wounds, 2 plane crashes, and 2 years as the most troublesome prisoner in Axis custody. His funeral was attended by generals and common soldiers alike. Rolf's funeral, 21 years later, was attended by unrepentant Nazis who gave Hitler salutes over the coffin. The final accounting history remembers them differently. Ralph, the bureaucrat who industrialized death, stole gold from ancient synagogues, worked thousands to death in Tunisian camps, and escaped justice to die comfortable and free. Carton de Wiart, the pirate who pulled grenade pins with his teeth, tunneled through stone with one hand, walked 150 miles at 62, and became a legend that terrified his captors precisely because he represented something they couldn't break. In North Africa, in the tunnels beneath Italian castles, in the stories that spread through guard posts and prisoner camps, one truth emerged. The real nightmare wasn't the one-eyed general. The real nightmare was the SS colonel with perfect vision who saw humans as problems requiring bureaucratic solutions. One man fought, the other murdered. One became a hero, the other became a case study in how evil doesn't need fangs, just filing cabinets. Adrien Carton de Wiart gave the SS nightmares because he represented the opposite of everything they believed. That will matters more than ideology, that one man refusing matters more than 1,000 obeying, that humanity survives not through systems, but through individuals who simply will not quit. The pirate lived honestly. The bureaucrat died free. History eventually judges both. If this story left you stunned, you're going to be absolutely blown away by what you're about to see next. Another forgotten hero. Another impossible situation. Another moment where one man's refusal to follow orders changed everything. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one.